Hi everyone, I'm here to represent the Corregidine Working Group today as I present again an evaluation of the Lake Huron Cisco Restoration Program. So I just want to recognize before I dig in, everything I'm talking about today follows the consideration of roughly 3 decades of conversations regarding the restoration of Cisco. So following all those considerations, we've landed on a stocking program that involves the collection of wild gametes from northern Lake Huron, transport of those gametes to the Jordan River National Fish Hatchery, incubation and rearing to fingerling stage, and then stocking into Saginaw Bay at Whitestone Point. I'll add here that part of the plan of this restoration program was to incorporate both spring and fall plants for comparison throughout monitoring. Speaking of monitoring, partners all associated with this working group basically monitor Cisco at every life stage throughout Saginaw Bay, spanning from embryonic all the way through adult recaptures. So U.S. Geological Survey sets egg traps in the fall near the stocking site. Larval Cisco are monitored through new tontos in the spring. Juvenile Cisco are monitored through both spring beach seines as well as gill netting. And then finally, during the putative spawning period, Cisco are sampled again with large mesh gill nets. So the restoration program or actual stocking began in 2018 and was prescribed for a 10-year period. Right now it's 2026. This will be the 9th year of stocking Cisco into Saginaw Bay. And so as we approach this 2027 deadline, perhaps, now is the time to begin considering what are the next steps for the program. So earlier this year at the Lake Huron Technical Committee meeting, the Corregidine Working Group received a charge basically to give a summary of all of our monitoring to help kickstart some of these conversations about the future of the program. So I'll be trying to summarize as much of this information as I can in a 15-minute talk. And from this point on, I'm going to be moving stepwise through each of the components of this charge to describe the best of our knowledge collectively as the working group. So the first component of the charge was basically to summarize the evidence of progress towards objectives. And these objectives were actually established with the charter document for the stocking program. So there are numerous objectives listed in that stocking program plan, 5 of them, and I'll go through each of those here. So the first objective of the stocking program plan was determining whether cultured Cisco can actually survive to maturity in Lake Huron, or specifically Saginaw Bay where they've been stocked. Through all of the gill netting surveys that have occurred throughout monitoring, we determined yes, Cisco that have been stocked into Saginaw Bay can mature, grow to an old enough age to spawn. Throughout gill netting, just between 2021 through 2025, 75 Cisco have been recaptured and assigned to the stocking program either through OTC mark confirmation as well as genetic sequencing to tie them back to that northern Lake Huron genotype. The next objective of the stocking plan was to determine whether those mature Cisco would then home back to their stocking areas, Whitestone Point, to spawn. So I'll draw your attention to this map to the right. That yellow diamond represents the most common, the most consistent stocking site for Cisco. It's called Whitestone Point. And you can see every blue or red point on the map represents a location where an adult mature Cisco has been captured. What you'll see is the majority of those recaptures in blue are near Augrey River or Whitestone Point. And of those 75 I mentioned that were mature, 64 were captured in those fall spawning surveys. Majority males, but also some ripe females as well. The third objective of the stocking program was to determine whether we could detect natural reproduction of those cultured Cisco. Overall, we have not yet found a large extent of evidence for this. U.S. Geological Survey and their egg traps collected 4 eggs near Whitestone Point. That would have been in fall 2024. However, through genetic sequencing, they were actually assigned as wild progeny from the Bruce Peninsula strain. So here on the right, you'll see a map. This is just the effort from spring 2024 and 2025 new stand tows from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. These tows have actually occurred further years back, but you can only fit so many points into Saginaw Bay. Through all of those new stand tows, actually 0 Cisco larvae have been captured. There have been numerous Corriganines captured in those tows, but they've all been genetically assigned as lake whitefish. If you can see the red points on the edge of Saginaw Bay, those represent beach seine locations where young of years were surveyed. And notably, actually, 6 young of year Cisco were captured in those beach seines and genetically assigned to Les Chenaux Islands. So putatively, those were likely progeny of the cultured Cisco that were planted into Saginaw Bay. And I'll point out that those captures took place at Tawas as well as Port Austin. So they seem to be moving more into the outer bay once they reach that young of year stage, based on a small number of captures. The fourth objective of the stocking plan was to determine whether mature wild progeny of the stocked Cisco fingerlings would also return for spawning. To this point, no, the only wild Cisco that had been captured at Whitestone Point during the spawning surveys were again genetically assigned to that Bruce Peninsula genotype. However, I just wanted to point out, on the right here, this is the distribution of the ages of Cisco that have been collected in northern Lake Huron during gamete collections. The age at maturity of Cisco is likely somewhere around 4 years old, and so realistically, we began stocking Cisco in 2018. That means the earliest that they may have widely reproduced could have been, say, 2021 or 2022. So we're actually just now likely reaching the point where any wild progeny of that stocking actually could reach maturity and maybe be able to return to spawn. The last objective of the stocking plan was to evaluate the dispersal of those stocked fingerlings, where they go and what their fate is once they've been stocked at Whitestone Point. These are preliminary figures shared with me by Todd Hayden. He's just started with a second telemetry study of these fall plant Cisco fingerlings. And what he's found so far is it appears that those fingerlings have very fast movement upon stocking. And I think really interestingly, he found based on the tags that there's roughly 20% survival of fingerlings at the 2-month point. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I actually felt like, that's pretty good. Okay, so now on to the next portion of the charge. So I just talked about all of the monitoring that's take place according to the objectives of the stocking plan. Now we're moving into thinking about future directions and decisions. So I'm going to begin talking about some implications for the continuation of stocking. The first part of this subject is whether there's evidence to support the continuation of stocking. First, when we were talking about this as a group, we were thinking about the context of this restoration relative to other native species restorations that take place throughout the Great Lakes. For example, lake trout. We're approaching the 9th stocking year of Cisco, and based on the capture that we've seen throughout our monitoring, it seems that we've established some level of spawning stock biomass in the system. Dave Fielder and Kevin McDonnell simulated the restoration of Cisco in Saginaw Bay based on different recruitment regimes. And what they found is that if Cisco recruitment was represented by some boom-bust years, it's more and more likely that wild recruitment would occur if you extend that spawning, the longevity of that spawning stock biomass with continued stocking. In fact, in their paper, they concluded stocking beyond 10 years would definitely increase the chance of wild recruitment and establishment of a sustainable population to persist. Okay, some evidence against or suggesting limited effectiveness of the stocking of Cisco. Well, I just described all of the lack of evidence of wild recruitment to this point, but also suggested the context of we're just at the start of this program. We've seen very few eggs, and they've all been assigned to the Bruce Peninsula genotype further east in Lake Huron. We've captured actually 0 larvae in tons and tons of new stand tows throughout Inner Saginaw Bay. Michigan DNR as well as U.S. Geological Survey are also monitoring in different surveys throughout not only Saginaw Bay, but broader central Lake Huron. and have to this point not yet found evidence of Cisco sort of radiating out as a result of the stocking program. And then while finally it's very positive that we're capturing mature adult Cisco that appear to be spawning at Whitestone Point, I'll still add they are relatively rare in the system to this point. And then finally, some information gaps that would contribute to our understanding of decisions for the continuation of stocking. The embryonic survival or the hatch rate of Cisco embryos in the system is still somewhat unknown. In fact, this was a very sensitive parameter in Fielder and McDonald's simulation model. We also are unsure sort of the fate of larval Cisco or where they spend their duration, whether that's more in the inner or outer Saginaw Bay. Predominantly, most of the new tows have occurred in inner Saginaw Bay. It's entirely possible we're just not monitoring the right areas, and maybe we'd find more evidence elsewhere. To that same end, we've mostly focused our fall surveys on the stocking site. However, it's entirely possible mature Cisco are forming spawning aggregations in other areas and are just not yet detected. It's also interesting to see this potential interaction with the Bruce Peninsula Cisco population. Not only have we found progeny from that wild population, but also adults sort of congregating in the same spawning aggregations. I think it's very important to consider that. And then finally, throughout the discussions of this program, there have always been questions about diversifying stocking sites, considering other places beyond Saginaw Bay where maybe Cisco could be stocked and have a better response, such as Thunder Bay. Okay, the third component of this charge was to determine or compare the spring versus fall stocking of Cisco. So first, just thinking about the relative performance of each of those stocking times. To date, there have been 3.4 million spring fingerlings that have been stocked and 5.6 million fall plants, so more fall than spring. However, despite that, we actually capture far more spring capture or spring plant Cisco than fall in all of our monitoring. And this again is based mostly on OTC marks. In fact, the most common year class of all the Cisco that have been recaptured is 2019. And again, those were mostly assigned to spring plants. However, if you look at this diagram to the right showing the numbers of fall and spring plants of each year, you'll notice that actually the majority of Cisco planted in 2019 were actually during the fall stocking event. So despite that, we're capturing spring Cisco from that year. Okay, considering some operational, ecological, and logistical trade-offs relating to the timing of stocking, speaking to the operational aspect of this, Jordan River National Fish Hatchery has actually already switched to only spring plants for the remainder of this 10-year program. That's again speaking to logistical or hatchery constraints on that front. Ecologically, there are a lot of questions relating to whether spring or fall would be better. One would be considering the thermal regimes experienced by the larval embryos as they're incubating or being reared to fingerling stage. This is a figure shared with me by Bo Bonnell. It's showing both spring and fall thermal regimes during the embryonic incubation period in the hatchery. And what it really suggests is that the fall plant Cisco, temperature-wise, have a far more similar experience to the wild than the spring plants that have to sort of get kick-started growth due to earlier warm-ups to reach size to be stocked earlier in the spring. And then finally, considering logistical, to stock Cisco in the fall means you have to hold those fish in a hatchery for longer, and so of course there's going to be some logistical constraints, increased effort related to just that additional holding or handling time. Some uncertainties relating to the timing of stocking. One question we have, I guess I'll point your attention to the right first. The way we can tell between spring and fall plant Cisco in Saginaw Bay is based on these OTC marks. So for spring plant fish, there's just one OTC mark that we can find in the vertebra, and for fall plants, there's two marks. One question we have, seeing that we've assigned far more fish to be spring plants, a question could be, is it possible that those marks are sort of combining as the fish grows larger, and perhaps maybe we're misassigning or misidentifying Cisco as spring plants just because it's hard to distinguish those OTC marks. So there's ongoing research to try to figure that out right now at USGS. Another question could be behavioral differences between Cisco that are stocked in the spring versus the fall. It's obviously a very different thermal regime, perhaps a completely different environment. Maybe there's more precipitation or runoff that increases the likelihood of spring plant Cisco to home, is one thing we discussed. Further research into that could be useful. I'll also point out for the telemetry studies, those have predominantly been fall plant Cisco because they grow to a bit larger size and can handle the tags better. Third, some ecological rationale for these potential differences between spring and fall plants. Maybe there are, or likely there are seasonal differences in predators or prey availability in the system as they're stocked. And we also don't have a handle on growth or developmental differences, I guess biologically, between those spring and fall plant fingerlings. Okay, the fourth component of the charge was considering the stocking magnitude. So to this point, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has planted 1 to 1.5 million Cisco fingerlings each year across those springs and falls. And one question that LHTC presented to the working group was whether the current stocking levels were sufficient, limiting, or excessive. Through our conversations, we decided the 1 or 1.2 million Cisco fingerlings is likely sufficient. We're seeing a return of stocked individuals to spawn at the stocking site based on our current levels. And we also suggest that the establishment of a sustainable Cisco population may hinge more on wild recruitment than minor differences between the number of fingerlings that are stocked each year. And further, we have not detected any form of density dependent type relationships that would suggest excessive stocking to this point. The second portion of this component was whether there were uncertainties related to evaluating the proper number of Cisco fingerlings that should be planted each year. There are some uncertainties. So Fielder and McDonald did a great job with their simulation model, evaluating how many fingerlings would lead to a successful restoration. However, we can't really empirically test these values because it's been a consistent number of fingerling plants each year. So we can't do cohort or year class strength analyses that would point to differences in stocking levels. Third, considering stocking magnitude, what are some risks or constraints of increasing the stocking numbers? Within the hatchery, initially Jordan River National Fish Hatchery was maintaining a captive brood to supplement the stocking numbers of the program. However, disease became prohibitive for maintaining or keeping those captive brood alive. Also, as always, there's hatchery space and personnel considerations or constraints with how many fingerlings that can be raised in their system. From a gamete collection perspective, there's also a constraint on how many boats, how many crews, how many gill nets can be on the water to capture more wild embryos to rear in a hatchery. And there's also a potential risk of actually overfishing those extant northern population stocks to try to stock into Saginaw Bay. Finally, some brood source considerations. So thinking about the genetic appropriateness, Northern Lake Huron stocks were selected as the brood source for this stocking, just considering genetic pollution risk toward those extant stocks. So taking from within Lake Huron and keeping that strain in Saginaw Bay was considered maybe safer from a genetic pollution standpoint than bringing new genotypes in from other systems. However, Amanda Atkis, for example, is doing great research to understand or gain understanding on the connectivity of these extant populations throughout Lake Huron as well. Next, thinking about brood source limitations, I've already mentioned the potential of overfishing these northern Lake Huron populations. We have not seen evidence of that so far. However, it would be very concerning if suddenly we stopped finding the Cisco spawning aggregations that we've been seeing in years past. If there was consideration of other potential sources like Lake Superior, maybe Georgian Bay, maybe Bruce Peninsula, we would suggest there need to be a comparison of catchability at those sites to make sure that we're able to get the necessary number of gametes to then meet our stocking goals. And finally, some other brood source uncertainties. We've only stocked this northern Lake Huron genotype into Saginaw Bay, so we can't compare the performance of, say, Lake Superior Cisco and Saginaw Bay because we haven't tried that. So there's really no way at this point to know, again, empirically, whether there's a difference. Similar to how with lake trout, numerous strains were stocked, and then that was evaluated. And finally, as we see these interactions with the Bruce Peninsula Cisco, them showing up at the Whitestone Point, I think, again, this leads to some questions about genetic mixing and concerns with spreading unnatural genotypes to an extant population. So I know I'm kind of running over on time here, but to summarize and provide some recommendations, is there evidence of progress towards the objectives laid out by the stocking program? Yes, we're seeing survival of the fingerlings that are stocked to maturity, and they're returning, likely to spawn where they've been stocked. Relating to the timing of stocking, we've seen a higher recapture rate of spring plant Cisco than fall, and logistically, it seems to be more suitable than fall plants. As far as stocking magnitude, we recommend no change, but continuing research of potential recruitment bottlenecks that may hinder that wild recruitment that we need. And then finally, considering brood sources, Northern Lake Huron sort of represents the lowest risk because we've already done that. So changing brood sources now would represent potentially introducing new genotypes to the system. However, we do recommend continued research of alternate sources and connectivity across the extant populations. So sorry for running over. If I have time, I can take any questions, but otherwise, thank you all for your attention.